Welcome back, everybody. Today we're doing a deep dive into the story of Christopher Columbus. We've got some excerpts from Columbus in the New World here, and let me tell you, this isn't the simple tale you might remember from school. Columbus actually died a disappointed man. How is that possible? I mean, he's the guy who discovered America, right?
Well, that's where things get interesting. There's more to the story than that. For starters, navigating the open ocean back in the 1400s was a whole different ballgame. Forget GPS and satellite imagery. Sailors were working with tools like astrolabes and quadrants, using the stars to kind of estimate their position.
Wow, so even figuring out where you were was a challenge. I can see why a journey across the Atlantic would be seen as incredibly risky back then.
Absolutely. And remember, this was a time when the fastest way to get information anywhere was by ship. So what motivated Columbus to take on such a daunting voyage with such limited tools and significant uncertainty?
Yeah, what did make him do it?
It all comes down to spices.
Spices. I'm imagining salt and pepper,
Yeah.
but I have a feeling this is something a bit more exotic.
You're on the right track. Europeans were crazy for spices from Asia. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These were luxury goods that added flavor to food and were even believed to have medicinal properties.
Wow, really?
But the existing trade routes, largely controlled by the Ottoman Empire, were long and expensive.
So Columbus saw a business opportunity. Find a cheaper route, undercut the competition, and become the spice king of Europe. I can already see the headlines.
Exactly. Columbus believed that a shorter route to Asia lay westward across the Atlantic. Of course, he had no idea about the landmass we now know as the Americas standing in his way. His calculations, based on the best knowledge available at the time, led him to believe the journey would be much shorter than it actually was.
And this miscalculation is ultimately at the heart of his later disappointment, isn't it? He spent years searching for a passage to Asia that simply wasn't there.
You're getting ahead of the story, but you're right. The irony is palpable. He stumbles upon a vast new continent, yet remains fixated on reaching Asia. But to get to that point, he needed someone to back his ambitious plan. Enter King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain.
Ah, yes, the royal sponsors. I bet getting them on board wasn't easy. They must have had some reservations about funding this risky westward venture.
You can imagine the skepticism. But Columbus was a persuasive salesman. He argued that a new trade route to Asia would bring Spain immense wealth and power. Ultimately, the lure of spices and riches outweighed the risks.
So with royal backing secured, he set sail with his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Did he just point them west and hope for the best? What did this journey actually look like?
Or imagine weeks at sea, cramped quarters, dwindling supplies, and the constant fear of the unknown. The journey was far more arduous than most people can comprehend today. The sailors were getting restless, to say the least.
I can only imagine. I get anxious after a few hours on a plane. These guys were out there for weeks on end, with no guarantee of finding anything but more ocean.
Exactly. The crew was on the verge of mutiny. They wanted to turn back. But Columbus, ever the determined leader, managed to negotiate a compromise.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What was the deal? Did they draw straws? Flip a coin?
He made them an offer. 3 more days. 3 more days of sailing westward. And if they didn't find land, they would turn around and head back to Spain. It was a risky gamble, one that could have very well ended in failure.
Talk about pressure. That's a whole lot riding on 72 hours. So did they find land? I'm guessing yes, considering we're talking about Columbus discovering America.
Well, yes. But the land they encountered wasn't quite what Columbus was expecting.
Wait, so it wasn't the shores of Asia? Where did they actually end up?
They landed on an island in the Bahamas, likely the one now called San Salvador. But Columbus, convinced that he'd found a shortcut to the East Indies, clung to his belief that he was just off the coast of Asia.
So he literally bumped into a new continent but failed to recognize it for what it was. That's a pretty big oversight. But I'm guessing this miscalculation has some significant consequences. What happens next?
This is where the story takes a fascinating and ultimately tragic turn. He might have made landfall in the Americas, but his heart and mind remained fixed on reaching Asia, a goal that would ultimately elude him.
Okay, so Columbus is standing on this island in the Bahamas thinking he's just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the spice markets of Asia. But he's not. He's stumbled onto a completely new landmass. And that has to have some pretty major implications, right?
It does, and one of the most immediate and unfortunately lasting impacts is reflected in the name he gives to the native people he encounters. Because he believes he's reached the East Indies, he calls them Indians.
And that term, born out of a geographical blunder, sticks for centuries. It's incredible how a simple mistake can have such a profound impact on how we perceive and label entire groups of people.
It really highlights the power of language and the importance of understanding historical context. This misnomer, Indians, underscores the way in which European perspectives shape the narrative of exploration and discovery, often at the expense of accuracy and respect for the people who already inhabited these lands.
It's a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts, but a story told from a particular point of view. And in this case, the point of view is very much Eurocentric.
Exactly. And this perspective influences not only how Columbus sees the native inhabitants, but also his overall goals and actions. He's not interested in understanding their culture or way of life. He's focused on finding gold and a passage to Asia.
So he sets sail back to Spain, carrying not only gold and exotic treasures, but also this misconception that he's found a westward route to Asia. What's the reaction back in Europe?
His arrival is met with fanfare. He's hailed as a hero, a visionary who's opened up a new world of possibilities for Spain. The gold and other artifacts he brings back further solidify this image of success and discovery.
I can imagine the parades and the celebrations. This must have fueled his ambition even further.
It does. This initial success paves the way for 3 more voyages, each one a grand expedition funded by the Spanish crown, with the hope of further exploring this new world, and finally, establishing that elusive trade route to Asia.
So he goes back again and again, searching for this passage to Asia that doesn't exist. You mentioned earlier that he died a disappointed man. Was this because he never found that shortcut to the spice markets?
Yes. Despite multiple voyages and years of exploration, Columbus never achieved his ultimate goal. He died in 1506, still convinced that he had reached the outskirts of Asia.
It's almost a Shakespearean tragedy. He makes this groundbreaking discovery, opens up the Americas to European exploration, yet remains fixated on a goal that was ultimately unattainable.
It is a tragic irony. He stumbles upon a vast new continent, teeming with diverse cultures and natural wonders, yet his vision remains narrowly focused on reaching Asia.
It makes you wonder what might have been different if he had been able to recognize the magnitude of what he'd found. Could he have approached the native people with more curiosity and respect? Could he have envisioned a different kind of relationship with this new world?
Those are important questions to consider. And they lead us to another fascinating twist in the Columbus story, the revelation that he wasn't actually the first European to reach the Americas.
Wait, what? There's someone else in this picture. I thought Columbus was the pioneer, the first to make this transatlantic journey. Who else was out there exploring?
For centuries, Columbus was celebrated as the first European to reach the Americas. But as we've learned, history is constantly being rewritten as new evidence comes to light. And in this case, that evidence points to the Vikings.
Vikings. You mean the fierce warriors with horned helmets who raided coastal settlements? Those Vikings?
The very same.
Yeah.
Archaeological evidence indicates that Vikings, led by Leif Erikson, landed in North America around the year 1000, almost 500 years before Columbus. They established a short-lived settlement in what is now Newfoundland, Canada.
So Columbus wasn't the first European to cross the Atlantic. That completely changes the narrative we've been taught. It's like finding out that someone else invented the light bulb before Edison.
It does challenge the traditional narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a reminder that history is not always a linear progression of discoveries and events. It's full of complexities and surprises, and our understanding of it is always evolving.
This revelation about the Vikings really puts Columbus's voyages in a different light. It's not just that he didn't find Asia, he wasn't even the first to reach the Americas. It begs the question, how should we remember him and his legacy, especially considering the impact his arrival had on the native populations?
That's a crucial question, and it's one that continues to spark debate and controversy. We can't ignore the devastating consequences of European exploration on the indigenous people of the Americas.
We've touched on this briefly, but it's important to delve deeper into the real cost of those voyages. What happened to the native populations in the wake of Columbus's arrival?
The consequences were profound, and in many cases, tragic. The arrival of Europeans brought with it diseases like smallpox and measles, to which the native people had no immunity. These diseases swept through indigenous communities, causing widespread death and devastation.
It's almost unimaginable. Entire populations decimated by diseases they'd never encountered before. It's a stark reminder of the unintended and often devastating consequences of human interaction.
And it doesn't stop there. The establishment of European colonies led to displacement, exploitation, and the destruction of indigenous cultures and ways of life. The introduction of new crops and livestock, while having some positive impacts, also led to significant ecological changes and disruptions to traditional food systems.
It's a complex and multifaceted story, with both positive and negative repercussions. How do we reconcile the advancements in navigation, the exchange of goods and ideas, with the undeniable harm inflicted on the indigenous populations?
That's the challenge we face when we grapple with the legacy of Columbus. It's a legacy woven with threads of brilliance and brutality, of exploration and exploitation. It's a story that continues to resonate today as we confront issues of colonialism, cultural identity, and the impact of globalization.
So where does this leave us? How should we remember Columbus in light of all this new information and understanding?
That's a question for each individual to ponder. We can't erase history, but we can strive to understand it in all its complexity. We can acknowledge the advancements that stemmed from Columbus's voyages, while also recognizing and learning from the devastating consequences they had for the indigenous people of the Americas.
It feels like we've been wrestling with some really heavy stuff, which makes sense given the weight of history we're dealing with here. We've got this iconic figure, Columbus, whose story is far more complicated than the one we might have learned growing up. And alongside his story, the equally complex reality of the indigenous populations he encountered.
It's a reminder that history is not a neat and tidy package. It's messy, it's nuanced, and it's full of contradictions. And those contradictions are often most evident when we examine the lives and legacies of individuals like Columbus.
So, what can we do with this more nuanced understanding of Columbus? I mean, we can't just erase him from the history books, nor should we. But we also can't simply celebrate him as a hero without acknowledging the full impact of his actions.
Well, I think one of the most important things we can do is engage in honest and open conversations about his legacy. Conversations like the one we're having right now. We can acknowledge his role in opening up transatlantic exploration, while also recognizing the devastating consequences for the indigenous people.
It's about seeing the whole picture, the good and the bad, and understanding how those different aspects are interconnected.
Exactly. We can also challenge the traditional narratives that have often glorified exploration and discovery without fully considering the human cost. We can learn more about the cultures and histories of the indigenous people, who were already living in the Americas long before Columbus arrived.
That's something I've been thinking about a lot during this deep dive. We tend to focus on the European perspective, but what about the perspective of the Taino people who Columbus first encountered in the Bahamas? What was their world like before his arrival? How did their lives change in the aftermath?
These are essential questions to ask. The Taino, like many indigenous groups, had rich and complex societies. With their own systems of governance, spirituality, and art, they had a deep connection to the land and a way of life that was in harmony with the natural world.
And that way of life was irrevocably disrupted by the arrival of Columbus and the subsequent wave of European colonization.
Sadly, that's the case. The Taino people were decimated by disease, enslaved, and forced to assimilate to European culture. Their traditional way of life was largely destroyed.
It's a heartbreaking story, and it's a story that's repeated throughout the Americas as European powers expanded their reach and influence.
It's a sobering reminder of the destructive power of colonialism. But it's also a call to action. By understanding the past, we can work towards a more just and equitable future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway? What do you hope listeners will remember about Columbus and his legacy?
I hope they'll remember that history is not a static monument to the past. It's a living, breathing entity that's constantly being reshaped and reinterpreted as new evidence emerges and perspectives evolve. And I hope they'll continue to engage in critical thinking and open dialogue about the complex legacies of individuals like Columbus and the impact their actions have had on the world we live in today.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this fascinating and at times challenging journey through history. And to all of our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. There's always more to discover